you got to find your tech stack. You need to master it so that you can very, very quickly turn any idea into a legitimate product. Each one of these websites is going to require 8 different things that I've come up with. I'm going to take you through all of those 8 things and which specific technology is going to fulfill that need. Let's do it. All right, so here are the 8 things that we need, and then I'm going to cover the technologies that are going to fulfill those needs. So the first thing, to give you an idea of what these all are going to be, is the front end. Obviously, you need the user interface. That's how people interact with your product. And then obviously, you're going to need the back end. This is how your front end is going to communicate with your database. And these 3 things right here are the most important part of your entire app. Every single web app is going to have a front end, back end, database. These are the 3 pillars of modern web development. You're also probably going to need storage. This is for things like, storing user images, or maybe you have users upload PDFs, whatever it is, you're probably going to need storage because pretty much every web app has images. Next, we have auth. So you could do this on your own, but as a solopreneur, what we're trying to do is very, very quickly make a product and get it to market. So you could do this from scratch. I would recommend using an auth library because it just makes it super easy to get started, and it's one less thing you got to worry about. The next thing we have is emails. So with auth, usually you're going to have to, send a verification email when someone signs up with an email. So for the auth providers that I use, it's going to send an email, and it does have a few free emails that it will send. But if you want to scale this to a lot of users, you're going to need your own email provider. For number 7, we have payments. Obviously, you got to get cash. That's the whole point of all this. And then the last thing we have is testing. And this is not absolutely necessary, but this is strongly recommended because you want to know, okay, if I have the button look like this versus that, is one of them going to do better than the other? Instead of just being like, yeah, this one looks cool, man. You want actual data to make these decisions. And so there are certain testing things, which I will cover, that make it so that you have a legitimate data-driven reason to decide to go with one way versus another. So for the front end, we're going to go all day long with Next.js. This is what I use. It's super easy to work with. It's very good for search engine optimization, which when you're creating a new website or a new web app, that is very useful because you want people to find your website. Also, a few things that will help with this, you're going to want to use Tailwind CSS, of course. I feel like in this day and age, it's almost not even worth mentioning that. Everyone's going to use Tailwind. It makes development much, much faster, especially when you're using React. Also, you're going to want to use Shad CN UI. This just has a bunch of pre-built components like, drop-down menus, dialogue modals, a bunch of things that every website's going to have. This has all of that tedious logic already written. All you have to do is implement it and style it a little bit. So then for the back end, we're also going to use Next.js. That's one of the benefits of Next.js, is that it's a front-end and back-end solution. And so when you ultimately have to deploy the front-end, back-end, and database, because this is one thing, you only have to worry about deploying this one project, and that will take care of the front end and back end. And at the end, I'm going to cover how you deploy all these things and actually get them on the internet. And so the next thing we have is the database, and we need the back end to communicate with the database. So I'm going to also write this in back end. We're going to use Drizzle ORM. This is how we're going to query our database from our back end. So we're going to be in our Next.js code, and we're going to use Drizzle ORM to get data from the database. And so I've used Drizzle ORM, I've used Prisma, I've used a lot of things. Drizzle ORM, easily the best. And that leads us to the database. For this, we're going to use Supabase and Drizzle ORM. So we configure Drizzle ORM in our Next.js project to communicate with Supabase. And so why Supabase is so good, you'll see, is because we're going to use it for database, storage, and auth. Instead of having a million different technologies for all these different things, Supabase is a one-stop shop. And that's one of the reasons it's so good. Even if it didn't have storage or auth, just using it for the database is very good. Just using it for storage, very good. Just using it for auth, very good. So Supabase is what you're going to want to use for all of these things. So we'll put Supabase right here, and we will also put Supabase right here. So for storage, you could also use something like AWS S3. That's a pain in the ass to configure. Supabase is so easy. For auth, there's a bunch of different auth providers. I prefer to just use Supabase because it's very easy, it's very good. But because I'm already using the database and the storage, it just makes my life so much easier having the auth in the same spot as these other things. So when a new user signs up, they're going to have to get the confirmation email. And Supabase does give a few free emails, but once you start getting real users, you're going to have to get your own email provider. And so for this, I use SendGrid, and SendGrid has a free tier, which is very generous. I've used the free tier. I haven't even actually paid for the paid tier yet. The first step of the paid tier is $20, but the free tier will go a very, very long way. So I would definitely use SendGrid. I've tried to use Mailgun and Postmark. I would recommend SendGrid. I've used a bunch. SendGrid is my personal favorite, but with this, you can use really any of those solutions that I just mentioned. For payments, we're going to use Stripe. There's a few other ones you can use, but Stripe is basically the most used one. And the reason that's good is because there are many, many resources to work with it. There's a million YouTube videos, bunch of online resources, and this is a huge company, so they are always on top of making sure their stuff works. I will say it is a bit annoying to work with their API, and their docs are huge, but even with all of that, I would still recommend using Stripe. So the last thing we have is testing. And for this, you're going to want to use PostHog. So what this does in your Next.js app, you set up a PostHog client, and then you go to the PostHog website and you can say, I want to make this button look like this to 50% of the people and look like that to the other 50%. And then you can get data on all of the clicks. You can see, oh, on button 1, people click it 80% of the time. On button 2, they only click it 20% of the time. So now you have actual data instead of just some opinion-based thing to decide, we're going to go with button 1 because people are way more likely to click it. So there's quite a few videos on PostHog. This is not absolutely necessary, especially when you're just getting started. But if you do want to maximize your chances of something actually working, you're going to want to use PostHog. So there's this book called The Lean Startup. And in that book, it talks about you need to ship like one feature and you need to test it. You need to get actual data. And based on that data, you implement a new feature or you change that feature. So I would definitely recommend reading that book if you want to be a solopreneur. So yeah, PostHog, I feel like was inspired by that book because it solves the problem that that book talks about perfectly. So another thing you're going to need to know is how to actually deploy this stuff and actually get it on the internet. So for the front end and back end, we're going to deploy these together. And the database, storage, and auth, we're going to deploy these together. So database, storage, and auth, that's one of the good things about Supabase is it's not just a technology, it also deploys all of this stuff on the internet. So under the hood, it's going to be using AWS. And so eventually when your website hopefully scales to millions and millions of people, you're going to have to pay a little bit more for this. But to just get started, this is going to be cheaper than AWS. So Supabase is very good for very, very quickly making new projects. And so for the front end and back end, we're using Next.js. To deploy it, we're going to use Vercel. It is so easy to deploy a website with Vercel. I actually have a video, I'll link it below, on how to do this. And then once you deploy it, you need to get a domain. If you just have some weird domain, that's not going to work out. You need a custom domain like whatever.com, or you can use, .io or whatever. So for deploying the front end and back end, Vercel, and then Namecheap to get the domain. Deploying this, you're going to use Supabase. So using all of this right here, you can build virtually any web app imaginable. So something else you might want to add is like some AI. Wouldn't really give that its own need. That's just like, a feature or a library. Every website's going to have its own features or libraries. But if you're going to want to use AI, that's very easy to set up. And I actually have a video on that and I will link that below as well. So there it is. If you learned something, subscribe. You want to learn some more? Watch this video right here. See you next time.